Bettelheim is widely recognized as one of the world's greatest living child psychologists. In this film, he talks about his life and work, which have been greatly influenced by his experiences in the Nazi concentration camps. In April 1939, he was released. The SS gave him 7 days to leave Europe.
I remember the exhilaration of walking the streets of New York. It was a hot summer day with blue sky, the sun was shining. At that moment I felt I have a new lease on life, and I will make a new life for myself, very different from the old one, now knowing the value of life as I've never known it before.
Bettelheim was one of the first to draw world attention to the Nazi atrocities. In 1942, he wrote a famous article based on his own experiences in the concentration camps, and later, General Eisenhower ordered all United States officers in Europe to read it. It was the first psychological study of human behavior in the camps. It described how particular groups of prisoners reacted to the most extreme stress and how individuals changed.
I do not believe that one ever gets entirely free. After liberation, the nightmares were practically nightly. Then they became less frequent. But even today, I occasionally have dreams. And the dreams are always anxiety dreams that one doesn't make it out of the camp. Lately, in the last 10 years or so, it was less of actual torture, but dreams of not being able to be liberated from the camp. There are reports, and I've talked to some old prisoners, former prisoners, and there are reports in the literature for former prisoners, and they all report the same phenomenon in regard to their dreams.
Bruno Bettelheim now lives in retirement in California. His interest has been the forces which build and destroy human personality, and he has devoted his life to the understanding and care of troubled children. For 30 years, he directed this residential school at the University of Chicago. Some of his patients were the most disturbed children it is possible to imagine. Among them was Sandy Lewis, now a successful financier. When Sandy was a boy of 10, he was one of a group of emotionally disturbed children who today owe their recovery to Bettelheim.
By the time I reached the Orthogenics School in 1950, I had reached the stage where I had fantasies about murdering women, dismembering them. I was very explicit in the discussion of which particular parts of their anatomy I would remove, and this was upsetting for all parties.
I had made some suicide attempts before I came to the school, and basically my father didn't know what to do with me anymore. I felt like my life was totally out of control. My mother had been ill for several years and passed away, and I was totally lost without her. I felt like I was very empty, that I had really no one to rely on, and I just didn't care about living. I didn't care what happened to me, and I didn't care about anybody around me. I cared, but not enough to want to try to make a go, but I think in a sense I'd given up all hope that anything could get better. I was just so miserable and unhappy.
Bettelheim has often said, in the beginning is the end, and he worried a great deal about beginnings, and I remember very well my own beginnings as a child at the school when I arrived and found my counselor standing on the front step of the school waiting for me, knowing my name, and greeting me warmly, and then escorting me into Bettelheim's office, where he both made clear the seriousness of the situation and what it was that the school had to offer to me. And it was clear from the outset that Bettelheim knew who I was and cared what happened to me.
Behind Bettelheim's work with children lies a strange paradox. His success is related to his own experiences in the prison camps. He was tortured and had to fight for his psychological and physical survival. He learnt from personal experience about the nature of fear, and this was to have a profound influence on his later work. Now, at 83, Bettelheim is one of the last survivors of the psychoanalytic movement to be trained in Vienna during the time of Sigmund Freud. He was born into a middle-class family in Austria at the turn of the century.
I was born in 1903 in Vienna to completely assimilated Jewish parents, and I remember very well the days of the Austrian Empire, as it was before 1914. It was a time of great progress, and most of all we believed in progress, and of great security. And I'm certainly grateful that my childhood was lived in a period of great security on the part of my parents. I think it gave me a lot of strength.
Bettelheim's interest in psychology began by chance one summer afternoon in 1917.
When I was 14, I was rather enamored with a young lady of the same age. My first girlfriend, to use modern terms, although we didn't use them in those days. One didn't date, but one went together in groups, in youth groups, in hikes in the Viennese woods, every Sunday, in winter skiing, in spring and summer hiking. And on one of these hikes, a young soldier in uniform joined us, who was on leave from the army to complete his medical studies at the University of Vienna. And he began to tell my girlfriend and me very excitedly about new information, the new knowledge he gained since he attended what later became famous as introductory lectures to psychoanalysis, which Freud gave for the last time in 1917 and 1918. And he began to talk about dreams and the importance of sexuality, rather heady stuff for us in those days. And my girl seemed fascinated by it, and while I was fascinated at first, the more she became interested in what this young man had to tell, the more disgusted did I become with the whole stuff. And by evening, when I came home, I was so upset about what I thought the alienation of the affection of my girlfriend that I couldn't sleep. And I was furious and angry the first part of the night, but around 2 o'clock in the morning, I came to a decision. If he can talk about psychoanalysis, so can I. And I decided to learn all I could about it. And the next morning, I had to go to school. But as soon as school left out, I went to the only bookstore in Vienna that carried psychoanalytic writings and Freud writings. And as far as my money went, I bought books by Freud, of which there were by then not very many, and psychoanalytic journals, and went home reading them. And as I began to read them, I became more and more excited and more fascinated, but I also realized that this was, in the views of my parents, kind of pornographic material, so I better hide what I was doing. So that was the problem, but I solved it, and by next Sunday I felt I was well versed in psychoanalysis to talk about it intelligently with my girlfriend. And I began to do so, but fortunately for both of us, after a short time she said psychoanalysis is fine for one Sunday, but 2 Sundays is too much, let's talk about things that interest us more. And so we did, so there was a happy ending to that. But I was so fascinated by psychoanalysis that from then on, I read everything I could lay my hands on and all of Freud's writings as soon as they appeared.
The discovery of Freud and psychoanalysis introduced Bettelheim to a form of observation that was to change his life.
Psychoanalysis is really not a tool, it's really an attitude of the importance of the unconscious in our lives, an attitude of not letting get oneself away with simple and convenient explanations, an attitude that realizes that much of our life we try to alibi rather than to face up to our own shortcomings, which is a first step to efforts of correcting them. It's an attitude of trying to understand other people uncritically, and certainly not on the basis of one's own frame of reference or one's own biases, but trying to understand the other person out of his own motivations, out of his life history, rather than on the basis of yardsticks which are derived from one's own experience.
Under the influence of Freud and his group, Bettelheim later trained as an analyst and began taking patients, some of whom were referred to him by Anna Freud. In particular, a deeply disturbed autistic child.
She was not talking, she was completely withdrawn, and had been declared by all American authority as a hopeless case who should be put away for life. But the mother, who was a very determined lady, could not accept this judgment, and first went to Piaget for help, and Piaget didn't treat children, so he sent her to Freud. And Freud, of course, didn't treat children, so he sent her to Anna Freud. And Anna Freud said it would be very, this is the earliest days of child analysis, and Anna Freud said it would be very interesting to find out what psychoanalysis could do for such a child, whether it could do anything. But it was very clear that psychoanalysis alone, one day a week, would not be sufficient, that for this child to have a chance to come out of her abnormal state was that she would have to live day in and day out, year in and year out, in an environment that was entirely based on psychological understanding of what might benefit such a child and what might be good child rearing in terms of psychoanalysis in the first place. After some discussion with my first wife, we decided to make an experiment and take this child into our home and try to arrange her life along these lines for a few months. Well, the few months stretched to 7 years, and it was prematurely interrupted by the advent of Hitler in Austria, when suddenly all these efforts had to be concluded, or interrupted rather. The girl made very remarkable progress. After 2 years, she began to talk, and 2 years later, she could begin to attend a special school, not a regular school, in Vienna, and learn to read and write. And it was a fascinating undertaking. I had ample notes because I planned to publish that, but of course the Nazis deprived me of all this material, so it's lost.
In March 1938, Germany invaded Austria. Many civilians were rounded up. One of those arrested was Bruno Bettelheim. He was taken to the Western Railway Station in Vienna.
And there suddenly the SS took over. And as soon as the SS took over from the Austrian police, beatings started, whippings and shootings. The train in which we were loaded contained about 800, as far as I can make out, prisoners. We were loaded in third-class carriages, more in each carriage than would normally be seated, but they were normal carriages, they were not cattle carriages. And as soon as we were there, a regime of terror started.
Bettelheim spent the next year in the Nazi concentration camp of Dachau and later Buchenwald. It was here, partly in an effort to retain his own sanity, that he began to analyze how the camps affected him and his fellow prisoners. These observations were later to form the basis of his study on human behavior in the camps.
The best way to understand the terrorization on which one lived was the situation when a friend of one was killed mercilessly, purposeless, in front of one's eyes, and one couldn't do anything. This was one of the tremendous conflicts. Should one try to help a friend and is likely risk to be killed, or should one not and have to live with the fact that one didn't come to the rescue? This probably was, to me, the most demoralizing experiences in the camp, to me personally. It was very hard to shake such an experience, but it happened not every day, but very, very often.
The SS wanted to change the prisoners permanently into passive subjects without any resistance and without any ability to oppose the Nazi system.
But different people reacted differently to this traumatic impact. Some way became more themselves, and others gave completely in to the SS as they would have no will of their own. An example of the latter was in Buchenwald, where a group of prisoners had resisted some inhuman order of the Gestapo, and the SS men ordered them to dig some ditches and to lay down in them, and then ordered another group of prisoners to shovel dirt on them and to suffocate them in this way. These other prisoners, out of fear for their own lives, obeyed the order without any resistance and began to shovel dirt on these prisoners. But before they were suffocated, the SS men ordered the prisoners to be killed to get out of the trenches, and ordered those who were willing to kill their comrades to lie down in the trenches, and now those who were first to be murdered had to shovel dirt on them, which they did, I believe, only because they had the experience that these people had been willing and ready to murder them. Very different was the reaction, which I did not witness, but which is reported reliably for many witnesses, of a Polish dancer in the extermination camp. Before she was to enter the gas chambers, the SS ordered her to dance, since she knew she was a dancer, and she danced, and danced so enthrallingly and captivatingly that she could dance up very close to the SS when grabbed his gun and shot him. So she died, of course, but she died in an extreme act of self-assertion and independent humanity, which was a very different death than simply to be murdered in the gas chambers.
Under conditions of extreme stress, many otherwise normal prisoners changed. Their behavior became increasingly bizarre.
It's easily comprehensible that if somebody suddenly uprooted of a normal existence and projected into the nightmarish existence in the camps and the continuous terrorization and fear for one's life, that one would develop strange reactions. And so did the prisoners. And I observed first rather casually how they behaved very differently from I knew they would have behaved before they were brought into the camp. And that, of course, created anxiety in me, whether I would be deteriorating in the same way, and the determination to resist as much as possible this deterioration. I could see in myself mood swings to which I hadn't been subjected before, to wishful thinking that I took for reality, knowing on another level that it was just wishful thinking, memory loss, and other phenomena. And so I tried to observe in others, and as I was systematically what happened to them. And as I did, I realized that they showed all kinds of psychotic reactions, which I've seen only in psychotic persons before, such as rage reactions, delusions, violent outbursts, even such things as anorexia, that is inability to eat, suicidal tendencies, and actually many prisoners committed suicide, so it was not just suicidal tendencies. And regression into childlike behavior, including incontinency, and that made sense because, after all, the prisoners had as little ability to arrange for their own lives, and were so as completely controlled as a small child is controlled by his parents. The worst deterioration of personality could be observed in a group of prisoners who had given up of all will to live, who were utterly passive, could no longer act, and no longer even respond emotionally to whatever happened to them. In the camps they were called Muslims, fatalists, who simply took fate the way it came without even being able to react to it. This reminded me of the autistic child with whom I had been living and working, who in the beginning of our treatment of her was equally unable to respond and to react. This has been described in the literature. In the Wild Boy of Aveyron, for example, a gun was shot in front of the ears of the boy, and he had no reaction to it, which is practically impossible to reproduce, but which is characteristic of those people who were no longer able to react to anything. Nearly all of these prisoners died within weeks or days after they reached the stage of utter deterioration. So that was another reason to watch oneself and try to understand what went on in oneself in order to protect oneself against such deterioration, and there my psychoanalytic training and understanding was a great help. Whatever one did in the camp, one did not do. One risked one's life. There was no certainty. There was no guaranteed safety. There was only guaranteed unsafety. It was a system of terror. And what I tried to keep in mind was that to a lesser degree, the guards too were terrorized. As a matter of fact, at various times, some SS guards were brought into the camp as prisoners. It is true they were treated somewhat better, and they usually didn't stay very long in the camps. But there was all times some SS man or even SS officer in the camp for some infringement that they committed. I kept always in mind that the SS too was terrorized by the system, because it was a system of terror. They were the executioners of the terror system, but they were still subject to the system. Unfortunately for them, many prisoners were not able to keep that in mind, to their detriment. I also tried to understand their value system, and I tried to study the guards as well as I could, and adjust my behavior accordingly.
To survive, one also had to endure freezing winters with inadequate clothing, and the frostbite, the hunger, the wetness, and the dirt.
I don't think that it was possible to experience the camps without having prolonged periods of depression and dejection. What amazed me is how many of the prisoners were not challenged through the camp experience to question some aspects of the previous life. Because if this is a world where such things are possible, then obviously some of their perspectives on life must have been erroneous. I certainly was subjected to very debilitating experience. I lost a great deal of weight with a kind of memory loss that goes with it, and which is really very scary because you're afraid you're losing your mind. So you use certain devices to prop up your conviction that your mind is still functioning, such as reciting to yourself quietly, or solving certain mathematical problems, or data of history, and so on. Different people use different devices for that. I certainly questioned many aspects of my previous life and speculated how differently I might organize my life if I should be lucky enough to survive the camps.
On the 19th of April, 1939, Bettelheim was one of a small group of prisoners whom the SS released without explanation. He was 36.
On release, of course, I was so emaciated, so exhausted, that I really didn't feel very much. Even the emotion on my sister had by then left Austria or Germany, but my mother had been waiting for me. And seeing her, I must have been very happy, but I don't think I had the strength of really feeling it. The exhaustion was incredible. The interesting thing is that one didn't dream or have nightmares about things that happened in the camp. These nightmares, in my case, and I talked with other former prisoners, appeared within days after liberation. That is, when one was no longer in immediate danger of these events actually taking place, one tried to deal with them in one's unconscious or in one's dreams. In the camps, one dreamt only of pleasant events. One dreamt of being reunited with one's family. One dreamt of having enough to eat, and that was a very frequent dream. So the dreams in the camp tried to encourage one to go on living.
Bettelheim settled in America, where he convalesced for the next year. His mother and sister later joined him there. His father had died many years earlier. Here, Bettelheim began a new life. While he was still recovering, he started to write his study on the concentration camps.
After I was liberated, a few months after the first shock had worn off, and after I finally got settled in Chicago, I began to write down these observations. And one of the motives for it was that I was amazed how many of former prisoners who were liberated, with whom I tried to get in contact, tried to deny everything that happened in the camp because it was too upsetting to them to recall the dejected state and the degrading things they had to do in the camp. So they repressed it all as if it wouldn't have happened. And that, I thought, was wrong, because it was too important an experience to repress it, because I know that repression would only have the strangest results on one's later life. So what I observed in the others, my own interest, and trying to work it through and to cope with it psychologically, in their combination led me to put down these experiences. Also, in part, because when I talked about the camp experiences, the validity or the veracity of my remarks was severely questioned. More reason to try to order these thoughts and get them in order to make them convincing to others.
In 1944, Bettelheim became the director of the University of Chicago's Orthogenics School, where he resumed his work with disturbed children. Once more, he was confronted with the extremes of human behavior. This time, the behavior of emotionally disturbed children who had been rejected by schools and hospitals, the children whom no one could stand.
I could not help making comparisons between my work at the Orthogenics School, where I tried to create an environment that in its totality would be personality integrating, reassuring, satisfying, with the entirely opposite environment of the camps, which was personality disintegrating, life destructive to life. And then it became apparent that for individuals of any age to show such extreme deterioration as the children with whom we worked showed must be due to mortal anxiety. That is, this is not a reaction that comes from a fear of being hurt or being rejected. the child must really experience that his very life is not only in danger, but about to be destroyed, to develop such extreme behavior as some of these children showed, such as homicidal and suicidal behavior.
One of the children at the school was Bert Kohler, now a professor at the University of Chicago.
The influence of the concentration camps on Bettelheim's own thinking was not unlike the kinds of extreme events that all of us as troubled children faced before coming to Orthogenic School, and in that sense, there's a parallel between Bettelheim's own life experience and ours. That as a result of being in the camps, Bettelheim looked at the ways in which people responded to extreme situations, both himself and other people he observed, and he said, what do people do when they're in extreme situations, and situations which are experienced by a person, felt by a person to be literally life-threatening? And he observed that the situation in which people find themselves can lead to a sense of inner chaos and loss of control, and that's common to his own life and that of the children he worked with.
One of the conditions for admission of children to the Orthogenic School was that treatment had been tried with them before and proved unsuccessful. Some of them had 2 or 3 treatment efforts with psychiatrists and clinics and were given up as hopeless. And our task was to demonstrate whether it was possible to help such children. So children came with a wide variety of behavior disorders and symptoms. Some were homicidal, quite a few were suicidal, some were non-speaking and mute, others were widely delusional. All had a most traumatic history behind them, which explains their behavior, although it was sometimes difficult to ascertain the story. Sometimes the story was right away available to us. For example, a girl, an autistic girl, came to us who had been born in Poland during the German occupation to Jewish parents. The parents were hidden in a cellar of a peasant whom they had befriended and whom they had paid a great deal of money to save them. But that was extremely risky for the peasant, because if it would be discovered that he was hiding a Jewish couple and their child, the peasant would be killed by the Germans. Not only was this a terrible situation for the parent and for the child to be born in the cellar, in addition, the mother never had wanted to marry the father. The father had pursued her, and she had refused to have anything to do with him, but he was very persistent. And when the German started the extermination policy of the Jews, the father had this connection with this peasant, offered her to save her life if she would live with him and marry him. So in desperation, only to save her life, she lived in this small, dark, danky cellar with a man whom she hated, and with whom she hated. So this union of child was born, and from the beginning she hated the child because she felt the child would die her even later when they should be rescued to this man whom by now she hated. And in addition, the child must not cry, because if the child's cry could be heard, all their life would be in jeopardy. So whenever the child started to cry, the mother or the father put a pillow over her mouth or had a hand over their mouth, stopping her crying. Now that wasn't the only hardship the child suffered, because of course there was inadequate food available and this incredibly tense, hateful atmosphere that surrounded the child from the beginning. In the case of this girl, the parents could tell us the whole story, because they were well aware that it was their relation in the cellar and the condition in which the child was born, and had to be muffled any sound in the cellar. It explained why the child was mute and refused to talk and was terrified by life. We succeeded in getting this child to talk and to reduce her terror, but the success if one can request, was very limited. The damage was too severe. So while we could make astonishing progress considering from where we started out, the child unfortunately was by no means cured. In this case, we knew exactly what were the causative factors of the terror and the muteness of the child. In other cases, it may take years till we find out, and sometimes we find out only by chance what the causative factors were. For example, an obviously very bright boy, also unable to learn, was extremely terrified by life and paranoid, clearly paranoid. What seemed to us widely useless. But as it turned out, what we had thought was delusional fantasies were actually reliving of unconscious memories. This we found out after the boy had been with us for 3 years, because his much older brother, out of his own guilt feeling, one day came to me, asked for an appointment, and of course I was glad to see him as the brother of one of our patients. And he said, I have to admit to you a story that I haven't told nobody before, because I think it might have something to do with the disturbance of my brother. And the story was the following. When our patient was 3 years old, the brother and his friends played cowboys and robbers, and including a hanging game. And they needed a subject to be hung, and they took my patient and hung him, actually. Put a rope around his neck and hung him, and his breathing stopped. At that moment, they got scared, they cut him down, and with artificial respiration, revived him. As if that wouldn't be bad enough, the brother and his friends were terrified that he might tell on them. So they established a reign of terror. They took him and threatened to kill him if he ever would tell about the story. They locked him up in an excavation, in a dark excavation, and kept him there, threatened he would be kept there for life if he ever told. Now with that, the paranoia, the terror and the delusions of the older boy made good sense. Of course, knowledge of this fact didn't cure him. For that, we had to restore his confidence in others and, most of all, in himself. And that life can not only be destructive, but life can also have positive aspects. In this case, a full recovery could be achieved, and he went to Harvard for his higher degree and became a university professor.
Bettelheim's remarkable success has been attributed to his uncanny ability to understand children's thinking. He was able to enter their world and make sense of it.
Like with any psychoanalyst, one learns a great deal from one's own analysis. And that is why Freud insisted that the prime condition for becoming a psychoanalyst is to undergo a long and thorough analysis of one's own, because in one's own analysis, one learns that much of one's behavior that was even incomprehensible to oneself and certainly to others had motives of which one hadn't been aware of, and once one unearths or discovers these motives, the behavior makes excellent sense. Now, if that applies to oneself, one must be able to apply it to others, based on the conviction that whatever anybody does, he does out of what to him seems the best way to deal with the situation as he sees it. So therefore, the first thing is to try to see the situation as the child sees it, as overpowering, as threatening, as inimical, as unreasonable, and then to understand through one's own experience how a child might react to this situation, because oneself might react to this situation in parallel ways. The difference is that as a mature adult, one has a great deal of control over one's impulses, where these very disturbed children have no control over the impulses. So we have to ask ourselves, now what are my impulses against which I have to control myself? And how would I act if I wouldn't have these controls? And with this kind of reasoning, the behavior of even the most outrageous behavior of children begins to make sense. And once it makes sense, it becomes much more acceptable. And that is important.
Once I became convinced that there was an environment where the logic of my behavior was an accepted thing. I think I began to believe that I wasn't crazy, and that perhaps much of what I thought and felt was in fact quite logical. In a sense, I had never doubted it, but in another sense, I really did doubt it.
What exactly do you mean by that?
By the logic of my behavior? Children and me, all children, I think, have a certain innate logic, whether they're well children or not well children. And the whole culture of the Orthogenic School is dedicated to the notion that children behave quite logically. And that all you have to do to understand these kids is to understand the meaning of their behavior.
The thing that helped me most at the school was the idea that there's a reason for feeling the way you feel, and that people do things for certain reasons, and they feel, they act and feel in ways that are logical. And that gives you a sense of control over your life, I think. And then you can make choices not based on impulse, which is what I had been doing up until the time I came to the school, but on what you really want to do. And I think that you have to take responsibility for your actions, and it makes life a lot more difficult, but I think it gives you control, and that's what I was totally out of control, so I was just living on impulses.
We tried to get every child to think for himself and not to think that other people have the answers or know the answers for them. Because while other people's answers might be quite reasonable or even intelligent, if they are not arrived to their own thinking, it won't be a good fit. The same I had to do, of course, for the staff. And while I did not try to indoctrinate them, which would have been deadly, would have made second-hand editions of me rather than to be their own person. And if they were not their own person, they couldn't help the children to become their own person. But I encouraged them to start out with the assumption that for whatever a child does, he has excellent reason for doing. And that you have to understand these reasons for a child doing whatever he did, as absurd or outrageous as it may seem what he did. It was the very best solution to a problem he could think of. That's why we had to respect whatever the symptomatology, whatever their behavior was, because it was the very best we could think of as a solution to their problem. Now our task was to guide them to find a more constructive solution to their problems than those with which they came to us. But still they had to be their solutions and not our solutions. It helped me a great deal when I observed the behavior of the children and saw parallel between their reaction and those I had observed in the prisons of the concentration camp, and some of them I had observed in myself and experienced myself. It made their behavior much more acceptable to me, much more understandable, and I had a direct, maybe intuitive empathy with what must have happened to them to lead to such outlandish behavior as we observed in many of the children under our care. Now, some of them had actually experienced severe traumatization, such as efforts to hang them or to drop them out of a window, or in one case a parent took scissors to the genitals of the child and threatened to cut them off. In other cases, it was more their imagination. And the difference, of course, between the concentration camp prisoner and these children was that these were relatively isolated events in their lives, which had a permanent influence on them, whereas the prisoner in the concentration camp was continuously exposed to such mortal anxiety. But I am convinced if I would not have been exposed to such terrorization, I could not have had the same empathy and understanding with the result of terrorization in the children, and as readily be able to accept whatever they did as understandable and acceptable, which was probably more important than anything else.
Bruno Bettelheim's lifelong commitment to children continues. And even now, After nearly 50 years, the influence of his imprisonment remains.
As much as I tried during all my days in the camp to protect myself against leaving the camp a different person than I entered it, this was my conscious desire, and I strove very hard to achieve that. But now in retrospect, I must say that one doesn't leave the camp the same person one enters it. That's impossible. One's values, one's attitude to life changes after one has a year of such experiences. One aspect that is a result of the camps and about which has been much spoken and written is the guilt of the survivor. The guilt which originates in the fact that one has survived when so many perished, who were certainly not better people or worse people, and one has to ask oneself, why did I survive? And I think there are only two ways really to deal with that, at least as far as I know. One is to deny the validity of the experience, to try to forget it as if it would never have happened. The other is to try to live a life that in some way seems to justify that one was the lucky one who survived. And of course one has to forget some of it, one can't live with it. As I described how the dreams change from the reliving of the tortures and the deprivation to a fear of not being released, and the dreams becoming less and less frequent. So I think also the guilt about survivorship reduces over the year. But there are many people who feel and have lived differently because of this experience. Some never overcome the bad effects. There are reports that people remain somewhat paranoid, unable to form lasting relations. Others burden other people with their terrible experiences. So again, there are great individual differences. I certainly found some relief from survivor guilt by trying to rescue children from psychosis.
Bettelheim is recognized throughout the world as one of the greatest living child psychologists.